The Pacific Ocean, vast and unforgiving, had become the most contested arena of World War II. It was a theater where strategies clashed like titanic waves, and commanders were forced to think in dimensions no military man had previously mastered. Among the towering figures who emerged from this stage, none played a more crucial and transformative role than Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz. Calm, methodical, and unshakably pragmatic, Nimitz would come to embody the United States Navy's will and intellect in the Pacific, steering its forces through some of the darkest days of the war and ultimately into its most decisive victories. Born in Fredericksburg, Texas, in 1885, Chester William Nimitz had the bearing of a man carved from discipline and vision. Raised in a family that admired engineering and order, Nimitz first envisioned a future with the Army, but a failed attempt at West Point opened the door to the Naval Academy instead. A twist of fate that would ultimately shift the balance of an entire ocean war. After graduating in 1905, his career progressed steadily. He commanded submarines, studied engineering, and earned the respect of his peers for being exact, brilliant, and modest. But the moment that would define him came on. December 17, 1941, just 10 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor had devastated the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Admiral Nimitz was summoned by President Franklin D. Roosevelt and appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. The wreckage still smoldered in Pearl Harbor. Battleships lay like sunken tombs. The morale of the Navy was shaken. And yet, as he stepped onto the harbor's shores for the first time in his new role, Nimitz refused to wear black or show grief. The Japanese made 3 mistakes, he calmly told a subordinate. They attacked on a Sunday when most of the crews were ashore. They missed our fuel depots. And they missed our aircraft carriers. That third point would become the linchpin of everything to follow. From the outset, Nimitz understood the war in the Pacific would not be won with battleships. The age of big gun duels was fading. The aircraft carrier had now taken its place as the queen of naval warfare. In this, Nimitz was ahead of many of his peers. He had the foresight to envision a naval war defined by distance, speed, and air power. A war fought over thousands of miles of ocean, where intelligence and logistics were as decisive as torpedoes. And bombs. His first test came in the spring of 1942. The Japanese Empire had stretched like a rising tide across the Pacific, capturing the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and threatening Australia. Nimitz knew he needed to check their momentum. Fast, he authorized bold hit-and-run carrier raids, striking targets across the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. Though minor in damage, they sent a clear message. The U.S. Navy was still alive and mobile, but it was in May 1942 that Nimitz faced his first true crucible, the Battle of the Coral Sea. Intelligence intercepts had revealed a Japanese plan to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea. If successful, it would isolate Australia and give the Japanese a base from which to threaten the southern Pacific. Nimitz dispatched Task Force 17, led by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, with the carriers USS Lexington and USS Yorktown. What followed was the first naval battle in history where opposing ships never saw each other, a pure carrier duel. Waged entirely with aircraft. Though tactically inconclusive, the Coral Sea was strategically a turning point. The Japanese invasion force was turned back. The carrier Sho was sunk and Shunkaku was badly damaged. The Lexington was lost, and the Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor in need of urgent repairs. Still, it was a blow to Japanese confidence, and a prelude to something even greater. Just weeks later, Nimitz would face the most critical moment of the war in the Pacific. Through the work of Navy cryptologists, particularly Station Hypo under Joseph Rochefort, the U.S. learned of a massive Japanese operation planned against AF, believed to be Midway Atoll. Nimitz gambled on the accuracy of this intelligence, ordering a feint to confirm it. When the Japanese responded to the bait, his belief was confirmed. The enemy's objective was indeed Midway, a strategic speck in the ocean, vital as a forward airbase and symbol of American resistance. Nimitz acted swiftly. He reinforced Midway with every available aircraft and dispatched 3 carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the damaged but hastily repaired Yorktown, to lie in wait north of the island. He placed his faith in surprise and in the aviators, who would fight against overwhelming odds. On June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway began. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had assembled the most powerful fleet ever deployed in the Pacific, including 4 frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Their mission was to destroy the American carriers, take Midway, and establish unchallenged dominance of the Central Pacific. But Nimitz had changed the rules. Using intelligence, careful planning, and the element of surprise, he turned the trap against the enemy. While Japanese aircraft were attacking Midway, American carrier planes struck the Japanese fleet. At 10:22 a.m., dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown broke through and scored direct hits on 3 Japanese carriers in the span of 5 minutes. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were engulfed in flames. Later that day, the Hiryu was also sunk. In one stunning blow, Nimitz had altered the course of the Pacific War. 4 Japanese carriers, along with many of their best pilots and aircrews, were lost. The Imperial Japanese Navy would never again regain the strategic initiative. The victory at Midway was not just a turning point. It was a revelation of Nimitz's brilliance, his ability to trust intelligence, to remain calm under immense pressure, and to give his commanders room to act decisively. But Nimitz was not one to rest on a single victory. He knew that the road ahead remained treacherous. Midway had been a victory of the mind and nerve, but reclaiming the Pacific would demand steel, sweat, and blood. The enemy still held vast territories, the Solomons, the Philippines, and the Marianas. If the United States was to reverse the tide completely, it needed a long-term strategy. It needed to strike and hold. Thus began the next phase of Nimitz's Pacific campaign, the island-hopping strategy. Unlike conventional warfare, this would bypass heavily fortified Japanese strongholds, focusing instead on capturing strategically vital islands to build airfields and naval bases, each step bringing American forces closer to the Japanese home islands. It was a war of attrition, patience, and logistics, all domains in which Nimitz excelled. As the weeks after Midway passed, the focus turned to the Solomon Islands and a place that would soon become legendary, Guadalcanal. The victory at Midway had given the United States a vital strategic edge, but Chester Nimitz knew better than to consider the war won. The Japanese still held a formidable empire stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. And among those islands, one name would soon burn itself into the consciousness of every American sailor and Marine: Guadalcanal. In the summer of 1942, Nimitz and the Joint Chiefs identified the southern Solomon Islands as the next key target in their Pacific campaign. Intelligence reports revealed that the Japanese were constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal, an airfield that, if completed, would threaten Allied supply routes to Australia and New Zealand. Allowing it to stand was unacceptable. Nimitz pushed for immediate action. Despite being short on ships, Marines, and carriers, Nimitz greenlit Operation Watchtower, the first major American amphibious assault of the war. It was a gamble, one made under pressure, but typical of Nimitz's leadership style, acting decisively when strategic opportunity presented itself, even when the risks were immense. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal, catching the Japanese defenders off guard. Within days, they had seized the airfield and renamed it Henderson Field. But holding Guadalcanal would prove far more difficult than taking it. What followed was 6 months of ferocious combat, on land, at sea, and in the air. Nimitz coordinated a series of carrier battles and supply convoys to keep the Marines supported. The sea battles, including the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the Battle of Cape Esperance, and the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, were brutal, often chaotic, and incredibly costly. Throughout the campaign, Nimitz's leadership was tested again and again. The loss of the carrier USS Wasp, the near destruction of the Hornet, and the damage to the Enterprise left the Pacific Fleet dangerously thin on air power. At one point, the Navy had just one operational carrier in the entire theater. But Nimitz never wavered. He worked closely with his subordinate commanders, particularly Admiral William Halsey, a bold and aggressive leader whose combat instincts perfectly complemented Nimitz's calm oversight. The Japanese were tenacious. They launched repeated attempts to retake Henderson Field, sending waves of reinforcements and aircraft. Battleships shelled the coastline at night. Starving Marines held the perimeter by inches. Yet under Nimitz's direction, American naval and air power managed to choke off the Japanese supply lines. One by one, their attempts were beaten back. By February 1943, the Japanese evacuated their last troops from Guadalcanal under the cover of night. It was the first major Allied land victory in the Pacific, and a devastating blow to Japanese morale. More importantly, it was a proof of concept. Nimitz's island-hopping strategy could work. The Japanese were not invincible. Their supply lines could be cut. Their islands could be taken. Guadalcanal had cost thousands of lives and irreplaceable ships, but it had also bought something invaluable: momentum. From there, Nimitz's strategy accelerated. The next targets were the Central Pacific Islands, Tarawa, the Marshalls, and the Marianas. These islands were closer to Japan and vital for building air bases for the long-range B-29 bombers that would eventually strike the Japanese mainland. In November 1943, Nimitz launched Operation Galvanic, an assault on the Gilbert Islands. The centerpiece of the operation was the Battle of Tarawa, a horrific three-day struggle against entrenched Japanese defenders. Over 1,000 U.S. Marines died in less than 76 hours. The ferocity of Japanese resistance shocked the American public. But again, Nimitz saw the bigger picture. Tarawa had been a brutal lesson in tide predictions, logistics, and amphibious coordination. And Nimitz, a man of data and adaptation, absorbed those lessons immediately. He restructured the amphibious assault doctrine. He insisted on more precise naval bombardment, better reconnaissance, and improved landing craft. Every battle was not just a step forward, but a step upward in capability. In early 1944, Nimitz set his sights on the Marshall Islands. This time, the lessons paid off. At Kwajalein and Eniutok, the invasions were faster, more efficient, and with far fewer casualties. American forces moved swiftly, knocking out Japanese airfields and establishing their own. The Central Pacific was becoming a corridor of American control, and Nimitz was the architect behind every strike. But it was the next phase that would bring Nimitz into a grander stage of global strategy: the Marianas Campaign. The Marianas, including Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, were not just stepping stones. They were the key to bringing the war to Japan's doorstep. From airfields on these islands, B-29 bombers could reach Tokyo itself. Nimitz understood their value better than anyone. In June 1944, he launched the assault. The Battle of Saipan was long and bloody, fought over dense jungles and volcanic hills. Japanese resistance was fanatical, with many civilians driven to suicide by the belief that Americans would slaughter them. Nimitz followed the battle closely, coordinating supply lines, reinforcements, and the naval bombardment. He knew that this battle had political stakes too. Its outcome would influence public perception of the war. But as Saipan raged, a new threat emerged: the Japanese fleet seeking to counterattack. Nimitz responded with stunning speed. He directed the Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance to intercept them. The result was the Battle of the Philippine Sea, a carrier engagement of unprecedented scale in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. U.S. pilots shot down over 300 Japanese planes in a single day, decimating Japan's naval air power. 2 Japanese carriers were sunk, and the remainder retreated in disarray. The Imperial Navy had been shattered as an offensive force. With Saipan secured and the Japanese carrier threat neutralized, the way was open to Tinian and Guam. Within weeks, the islands were taken. Runways for B-29 bombers were carved out with astonishing speed. From those very runways, a year later, the bombers that would drop atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki would take off. Nimitz, never boastful, quietly acknowledged the transformation. Japan could now be reached directly. The arc of the war was bending decisively toward victory, but there were still vast stretches of the Pacific to be fought over. And Nimitz, always looking ahead, had his eyes fixed firmly on the Philippines, and then, beyond them, on the final steps toward the Japanese home islands. With the Marianas now under American control and air bases operational, the war in the Pacific had entered a new and decisive phase. B-29 superfortresses were already beginning to rain destruction upon Japanese cities, but Chester Nimitz understood something more fundamental. Bombing alone wouldn't bring surrender. Japan's defensive perimeter needed to be cracked open, its military bled, and its political will shattered. The question was where to strike next and how. To the south, General Douglas MacArthur had long pledged to return to the Philippines, fulfilling a personal vow made when he was forced to evacuate in 1942. Nimitz, coordinating strategy from Pearl Harbor and in constant communication with the Joint Chiefs and President Roosevelt, agreed that the Philippines held immense strategic value. Retaking them would sever Japan's access to oil from Southeast Asia, isolate their garrisons across the Indies, and deliver a psychological blow as profound as any military one. In late 1944, Nimitz began massing forces for the operation. His logistical network had now become an unmatched machine, a constellation of naval bases, supply convoys, oilers, repair ships, and mobile dry docks that allowed the U.S. Navy to sustain operations deep in enemy waters. It was Nimitz's mastery of logistics, often underappreciated compared to his battlefield decisions, that truly set him apart. His understanding of the vastness of the Pacific and the unrelenting needs of a naval campaign gave him the foresight to prepare months in advance for movements that would stretch the limits of endurance. On October 20, 1944, American troops landed on the beaches of Leyte. MacArthur waded ashore, famously declaring, "I have returned," but it was Nimitz's fleets that had made the return possible. The Japanese responded with desperation. They launched Operation Shoji, a complex counterattack involving their remaining surface fleet, intending to crush the American beachhead from the sea. The result was the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. 4 distinct engagements raged across the waters of the Philippines: the Battle of the Sibian Sea, the Battle of Surigao Strait, the Battle off Cape Ingago, and the Battle off Samar. Nimitz, commanding from his Pacific headquarters, allowed his admirals the initiative. Admirals Halsey, Kincaid, and Sprague fought with tenacity and skill. The Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, and multiple cruisers and destroyers. More importantly, they lost the last of their strategic naval initiative. The Imperial Navy, after Leyte, ceased to exist as a meaningful offensive force, but the battle also revealed a terrifying new enemy weapon: the Kamikazes. Pilots, many barely trained, were now being ordered to crash their aircraft into American ships in suicidal attacks. It was a brutal tactic, born of desperation and nationalism, and it stunned American sailors. Dozens of ships were damaged or sunk. The cost of every advance was rising sharply, Nimitz knew what lay ahead would be worse still. In early 1945, the focus shifted to the Bonin Islands, particularly a speck of volcanic rock called Iwo Jima. It was small, just 8 square miles, but its location made it essential. Japanese fighters based there were intercepting American bombers on their way to Japan. Taking it would not only deny the enemy an early warning station, but also allow crippled B-29s to make emergency landings on the return trip from bombing missions. Nimitz approved Operation Detachment, the invasion of Iwo Jima, and began assembling the force. On February 19, 1945, the battle began. What followed was one of the bloodiest and most haunting confrontations of the Pacific War. The Japanese defenders, under General Kurobayashi, had transformed the island into a fortress of caves, tunnels, and hidden gun emplacements. The American bombardment, though fierce, had failed to dislodge them. Marines landing on the beaches found themselves walking into pre-sighted kill zones. For 5 weeks the battle raged. Over 6,800 Americans were killed and more than 20,000 wounded. Nearly all of the 21,000 Japanese defenders were killed or committed suicide. The famous photograph of 6 Marines raising the flag atop Mount Suribachi became an enduring symbol of American sacrifice. But Nimitz, when asked about the battle, famously said, "Uncommon valor was a common virtue." Iwo Jima was taken, but the cost foreshadowed what was to come. The final step before the Japanese homeland was Okinawa. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, was Nimitz's final major campaign of the war. This was no small outpost. Okinawa was a true island fortress, 60 miles long and heavily defended by over 100,000 Japanese troops. Capturing it would give the U.S. a base just 350 miles from Kyushu, Japan's southernmost island, from which ground troops could one day launch a final invasion. On April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, American troops began landing on the island. The Japanese, learning from Iwo Jima, waited for the Americans to advance inland before unleashing their full fury. What followed was the longest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific Theater. Nimitz, coordinated naval support on a scale never seen before. Over 1,300 American ships were involved, including 18 fleet aircraft carriers, but the Japanese response was staggering. Kamikaze attacks came in waves, sinking destroyers, damaging carriers, and killing thousands of sailors. The USS Bunker Hill was nearly lost. The battleship Yamato, the largest ever built, was dispatched on a suicide mission and sunk by aircraft before it could even reach Okinawa. The land battle turned into a grinding war of attrition. Rain, mud, and bunkers made every inch a nightmare. Civilian casualties were staggering. Over 12,000 Americans died taking Okinawa. Between 77,000 and 110,000 Japanese soldiers perished, along with more than 100,000 civilians. It was a victory. But it was a revelation as well. For Nimitz, the question of invading the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, now loomed with terrifying clarity. Based on the ferocity seen at Okinawa and Iwo Jima, estimates projected over 1 million Allied casualties in a full-scale invasion. And the Japanese were preparing every man, woman, and child for defense. It was at this point that the war entered a new and fateful chapter, one that would close the Pacific War not with a landing, but with a weapon. As the fires of Okinawa smoldered and the Pacific settled into uneasy silence, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz stood at the helm of a war machine that had advanced across half the globe. The road from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa had been long, brutal, and relentless. He had overseen the transformation of the U.S. Navy from a stunned fleet reeling from surprise attack to the most formidable maritime force ever assembled. But the question now was, how would the war end? The decision ultimately fell not to Nimitz, but to President Truman and the highest levels of Allied leadership. Intelligence from Okinawa, Iwo Jima, and intercepted Japanese communications made one thing clear: Japan was not going to surrender easily. The defense of the home islands would be total, fanatical, and soaked in blood. The United States had developed a weapon that could end the war in an instant: the atomic bomb. As preparations for Operation Downfall continued, Truman authorized its use. On August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb devastated Nagasaki. The destruction was unprecedented. Hundreds of thousands perished, many instantly, others over time from radiation and injuries. Nimitz, a man of deep principle and discipline, had not been part of the decision-making process for the bombs, but he understood the strategic purpose. What weighed on him was the human cost. He never glorified the weapon. In private, he expressed concern about its use, and would later voice hope that humanity might never again resort to such devastating tools of war. But he also recognized that the alternative, a full invasion of Japan, would likely have led to millions of casualties on both sides. He accepted the finality of the bomb not as a triumph, but as a grim necessity. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's unconditional surrender. The guns of the Pacific finally fell silent. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, Japanese envoys signed the formal instrument of surrender. Standing behind General Douglas MacArthur, who served as Supreme Commander of the Allied powers, was Admiral Chester Nimitz, representing the United States Navy. Dressed in simple khaki, modest and steady, Nimitz added his signature, one of calm victory, not gloating. For Nimitz, this moment was not one of personal glory, but solemn closure. He had carried the weight of millions of lives across a vast ocean. He had fought not for conquest, but for peace, and now, that peace had arrived. After the war, Nimitz was named Chief of Naval Operations, the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. Navy. He led efforts to scale down the massive wartime fleet. While preparing for new global realities, the Cold War had begun, and the Navy was entering an era of nuclear submarines and guided missiles. Nimitz's forward-thinking leadership helped set the tone for modern naval doctrine. Yet even as technology advanced, Nimitz never lost sight of the human side of command. He worked tirelessly to support veterans, ensure fair treatment of prisoners of war, and promote reconciliation between the United States and Japan. He strongly supported post-war rebuilding and was known for his belief that peace must be maintained with the same vigilance as war. He declined opportunities to profit from his fame. He refused to write memoirs or bask in accolades. When asked about his role in the war, he consistently deflected credit to the men who fought under him, the sailors, the Marines, the airmen who had faced fire and fury. His humility was as profound as his strategic genius. In retirement, Nimitz remained active in naval affairs and international diplomacy. He lived quietly in California and continued to advocate for peace through strength. When offered the opportunity to be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, he politely declined, choosing instead to rest alongside his men at Golden Gate National Cemetery, shoulder to shoulder with fellow Pacific veterans. Chester W. Nimitz passed away in 1966. His legacy, however, endures in every carrier that sails the oceans, in every strategic doctrine studied by naval officers, and in the free nations of the Pacific that survived the storm. His battle, the one that changed the Pacific, was not won with brute force alone. It was won through intellect, patience, and quiet resolve. He did not seek attention. He did not shout commands. But under his steady hand, the tide of war turned. From Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay, Nimitz never lost sight of the mission, not to destroy, but to liberate. And in doing so, he shaped not only the course of a war, but the architecture of the modern world.